All right, so let's get going on today's class. So we're going to be finishing up our intro kind of look at picture perception and hopefully starting off on a little bit of the LA-MOAD theory today. So we got a little bit of catch up to do, but still plenty of time for it all. So once again, for today, we're going to pick it up on what is a picture. So last time we discussed why would a psychologist want to study picture perception. Part of it is because it is a behavior that we can do. But the other part of it is that it's a really great test and a really great way to develop theories of vision, because any theory of vision must be able to explain picture perception. So we're going to take a look at what a picture is, and then we're going to continue on with our definitions and objections by taking a look at three major definitions of pictures and some of the issues that they had. So Gibson, 1954, Goodman, and then once again Gibson in 1971. And then we'll mention the final objection, metaphoric images, which will lead us right into our look at the LA-MOAD theory. All right, so what is a picture? We saw a few examples last time. We ended with this one that shows just the power of pictures to communicate ideas, concepts, to represent things that we cannot actually do in the real physical world. So for example, a 2D image can be represented very easily in a picture, such as this square, but you cannot actually make a 2D thing in our world. One dimension where you just have width, 0 dimensions where it's just a point in space. All of these can be represented in images. And then even though pictures are 2-dimensional, they can also represent 3-dimensional space. And you can even extend that and allow them to represent 4-dimensional space, such as this tesseract, this cube, where every side of it is a cube. And we ended with this image here, which again is a 4-dimensional object, a tesseract, being rotated, and its projection into 3-dimensional space would look like that. The same way that if you take a 3-dimensional hand and you project its shadow onto a 2-dimensional plane, the shadow itself will change as your 3-dimensional object rotates. All right, so pictures can represent space, but even more kind of amazing, they can also represent time. So this is an example right here of a picture that represents time. And when we view a picture like this, our visual system, our perceptual system, our mind understands that this is not an army of young girls that is about to attack with multiple balls. We know that this is one individual that is being represented in motion over time. So we understand that this is the earliest one. She's picking up the ball, and she is throwing it, and she is rather pleased with the result. But this is something that we perceive, and you can perceive in a picture, even though it's static, you can still perceive time and the movement through time in that particular image. All right, so a better definition. We're going to go to Gibson, 1954. And just as an aside, whenever you read Gibson's work, it is very important to note the date of Gibson's work, because one of the things I really admire about him as a scientist is that he had no problems whatsoever with saying what he previously thought was completely wrong. So Gibson 1954 does not agree with Gibson 1971. So he was very open about not hanging on to ideas that he identified as being bad, even though he might have built a large amount of research on them. If he decided it was not true, it was very easy just to cast it out. And as such, when you discuss Gibson, it's always very important to say, oh, this era Gibson, so that we know where his mind was at the time, because he changed it very frequently with the evidence. He was not one to hold on to a particular approach. So what did he say back in 1954? He said a faithful picture. So faithful is in quotes. It's kind of like a loose definition here. It's basically a picture that communicates the idea. So for example, the pictures of tigers that we saw, those were faithful pictures. The picture of that other thing that we saw, remember the children's drawing that nobody could recognize? That's not a faithful picture. So it's not exactly that idea, but that kind of touches on a part of it. So a faithful picture was a delimited surface so processed that it yielded a sheaf of light rays to a given point, which is the same as would be the sheaf of rays from the original scene to a given point. That is when the adjacent order of the point of color in the cross-section of one corresponded to the adjacent order in the cross-section of the other. Big mouthful, but I'll go through what this is. So, first off, a picture is a delimited surface. So it's not an infinite surface. It's a surface with some sort of area to it. So this screen here is a delimited surface because it doesn't go on forever. It has edges to it. A delimited surface, so processed, i.e. drawn upon. So processed means we've added color and lines to this surface, that it yielded a sheaf of light rays to a given point. So that sheaf of light rays, if you've seen the ecological perception lecture, that sheaf of light rays is that cone of light that comes to a given point. So what he's saying is that a picture is a surface that's been painted on so that the cone of light from that picture to a given point is the same as would be the cone of light from the original scene to that given point. So better way to explain this is actually show it in a picture. So the core of this definition, this is called the point-by-point projection theory, is basically the idea of perspective projection. The core of this particular definition was that pictures are faithful pictures, pictures that look like and communicate that idea, communicate that concept, pictures that are recognizable. They are basically perspective projections. So let's take a look at perspective real quick. So perspective is a very important mathematical geometry for vision because perspective geometry determines the light that's entering your eye. In other words, perspective geometry determines the information that you have access to for visual perception. It determines the information that is available for processing. So this is why that is because our eye has a pupil here. That is the point where the light enters. So when the light is projected by an object outside, it goes through this point here, and the perspective geometry determines what the shape of that cone of light is when it hits your retina. It determines the information that you have access to. So this perspective system, this perspective geometry, this was discovered by Brunelleschi during the Renaissance, and that is the reason why, if you take a look at the history of painting, they went through this rapid transition where they didn't look very realistic. There were errors. There was people trying to perceive depth, and then all of a sudden they were completely realistic looking with tiles everywhere and depth everywhere. So this was a mathematical system that was discovered during the 1400s. But it is the mathematical system that determines the information that we have available to ourselves just because of the way that our eye is built. We have that point there, so it's a projection of cones determined by perspective. All right, so how is a perspective picture made? How do you draw if you're going to be drawing in perspective? Well, here's a schematic of how a perspective picture is made. And what you basically do is you have an outside object. You have the object that you want to represent. You have your picture surface right here, and then you have a vantage point right there. So that is where the artist is when they're drawing this particular picture. And any rays of light that come from this object will intersect that picture plane on their way to that eye. So any rays of light that are reflecting off this object will intersect the picture plane at a point on their way to entering that artist's eye. And that point on the picture surface is where you draw that part of the object. And if you do this for every single point of the object, you will produce a perspective picture. Mm-hmm.
Is that surface like see-through, or is it like looking over it?
This surface would be see-through. Okay. So in this case, for this demonstration, the surface is see-through. And honestly, one of the easiest ways to draw a perspective picture is to put a piece of paper on a pane of glass and just trace what you see through the paper. And that's literally what a physical way of doing what is being illustrated here. So clearly, though, artists don't typically draw on see-through things. So they had other techniques. One of them being, you know how oftentimes you'll see the artist with the thumb, and then they'll go to their picture surface, and then they'll go back, and then they'll go to their picture surface. That thumb is basically a tool for determining where's that point. All right, and now let me put it on my painting right there. That's what it is. So it's a way of getting around this, but definitionally, this is basically what you're trying to do. All right, so I'll give you another schematic of this. So if that is your object in the real world that you want to paint, that is the painter or observer that is right there. There's your picture surface right there. And again, what you would do is for any point on that object that you want to portray, you would find out where that intersected the picture surface on its way to the observer's eye. So you ignore all the other light that is going off in other directions. All you're caring about is what light is entering this observer's eye. And wherever that light ray intersects the picture surface, that's where you draw that particular point. And if you do that for point after point after point, and you reproduce those, you will reproduce a perspective picture of that particular object. And according to Gibson's definition, the key thing here, in order to make a picture a faithful picture, in order for a picture to be understood, in order for a picture to look like something, the key thing was that this cone of light, this tree-shaped pyramid of light that occurs in the real world, has to be duplicated by this cone-shaped, this tree-shaped cone of light that is produced by your picture. So a faithful picture is one that will reproduce the light that you would have gotten looking at the actual real object, but reproduce it by using that picture. So that's the core of that point-by-point definition. All right, so that's the point-by-point projection theory, and you can see here we mentioned René Magritte before, kind of playing around with that idea of this is what a picture is. So again, this is a picture inside a picture. Once again, kind of that treachery of images thing that we saw before. But this is a painting of the landscape. This is the actual landscape in the picture. And you can see that this looks very much like the landscape because it matches up point by point in this impossible way, but the illustration is clear. It matches up point by point with what is actually out there. So the light coming to you from the ocean, or that would have come to you from the ocean, is reproduced in this picture, is that same cone of light. So this is another example of René Magritte's work. And he kind of liked this idea. So here he did it for a forest landscape. Here he did it for a mountain landscape. And other people have picked up on this. So if you search the internet, you'll see images like this, which are basically using that perspective point-by-point structure. So once again, you do it by whatever light would have been coming from this person's hair is reproduced by that point. Whatever light is coming from this person's eye is reproduced by that point. Tinkerbell, I don't think, was there. But anyways, you can see that it's a matchup of the same light that would have come from the real object is reproduced in this perspective picture. So this can be done in other ways. So I don't know if that's the exact person, probably not. And that's definitely not the exact person. But again, it's that point-by-point correspondence, that kind of point-by-point matching up that makes a picture a faithful picture. All right, any questions on that so far? All good? All right. So the point-by-point projection theory had its objections. It turned out not to be a adequate definition of what pictures are. So once again, it sounds pretty good, but when people started delving into it, they noticed that it was inadequate. And mostly it was inadequate because it was too specialized. So some of the things that are actually pictures were covered by this point-by-point projection theory, but other things that we consider to be pictures that function the same way that pictures do were excluded And that just didn't make any sense. So things like line drawings. That line drawing of an airplane is clearly a picture, but it lacks that point-by-point correspondence. There is very little, if almost none, no point-by-point correspondence here in this picture. So there's no brightness in this picture. There's no indication of where the light is. There's no indication of light reflecting off of surfaces. There's no color to this picture. There's no texture to this picture. There's almost nothing of the real cone of light that would have come from this model airplane that is coming to you in this picture. So if this is to be accepted as a picture, that means that the point-by-point projection theory cannot be accepted as a definition of pictures. Other objections to Gibson's point-by-point definition comes in the form of caricatures. So this, most people would accept as a picture of Barack Obama. This is also a picture of Barack Obama. But there is very little point-by-point correspondence between the two. This one here has its perspective structure completely destroyed. And if you try to line this one up on top of this picture, you would notice all sorts of points that were not corresponding, that don't line up exactly on one another. And yet we still recognize all of these images as former President Obama. So the point-by-point correspondence theory would explain this as a picture. This one is photorealistic. This falls under that point-by-point correspondence theory, but this one does not. So the fact that we accept this as a picture and we recognize it as Barack Obama means that the point-by-point correspondence theory just cannot be true. It's inadequate. It doesn't cover enough. All right, any questions on that point-by-point theory before we go on to the next better definition? Maybe? All right. So the better definition came from Goodman in 1968. And Goodman's idea was that representations, pictures, the things that we call pictures, function in somewhat the same way as descriptions. So he went very kind of hard the other way, whereas Gibson went very hard bottom up. It's all coming from the stimulus. It's all coming from perspective projections. Goodman went very hard the other way and said, no, maybe it works something like a description. Maybe it works very top down. And he said that just as objects are classified by means of or under various verbal labels, so also are objects classified by or under various picture labels. So what he was basically saying was that the same way that we have classified objects under verbal labels, the same way that I can say the word dog, and all of you know what I'm talking about, the same way that I can say the word weekend, and all of you know what I'm talking about, those categories have been labeled by those verbal words. And there's really no reason why dogs are called dogs other than we have agreed that we should call them dogs. And that's why people under different languages do not use the word dog for dogs. They'll say dog, other people will say perro, other people will say chien. It's up to them to choose the verbal label. So he was basically saying that the same way that we've classified certain objects with these verbal labels, maybe we've also classified objects with these picture labels, with these visual labels. So the core of Goodman's definition here is called the symbol theory of pictorial information. And it is the idea that pictures are just composed of symbols. The same way that stories and novels and text are composed of symbols that we then decode because we understand the language, pictures are also composed of symbols, and we decode them or are able to understand them because we have learned the language, because we understand that particular language. So far, so good? All right. So an example of this is a painting, The School of Athens by Raphael here. So this is a very complicated picture, and yet when you see it, you are able to decode it. According to Goodman, you're able to understand this statement here because you understand the language. So for example, you know in this picture that this individual here is approximately the same size as this individual here, even though the size of this individual's image is much, much bigger than the size of this individual's image here. So why is it that when you look at this, you take a look at this and you say, oh, this particular person here is about the same size as this particular person here? According to Goodman's theory, is because we understand the language. We understand the language of pictures. We understand that higher in a picture means further away. We understand that smaller and higher in a picture means the same size. So these are symbols that an artist will use, and if they say to themselves, oh, I want to draw, that's Aristotle, I want to draw Aristotle, but I want to draw him further away. I want my audience to view him as being further away. What do we do in our language? Oh, of course, we have to draw him higher. And then to make sure that he seems the same size, we got to draw him smaller, because those are the picture labels that we've all agreed on is our way of decoding this information. So some artists will play on this and sometimes try to invent new symbols to add to our language. So the surrealist paintings of Dali, Persistence of Memory, tried to add this idea of the melting clocks in terms of, memory, I guess. I don't know if anybody really knows what it means, but memory kind of fading over time. So these types of paintings here, if you understand the painting, that means that you understand the language. If you look at this and you either miss the point or you're completely confused, according to Goodman's theory, it's because you don't understand the language. It's like you were brought up on English and this painting is French, right? So you look at it in the same way that if somebody was talking to you in French and you don't understand French, if somebody is talking to you in surrealist language, but you were brought up on Renaissance paintings, you're not going to understand what he's trying to say here. And then again, symbols that are used can be rather complicated. So here we have all is vanity. That uses the symbol of the skull, again, to imply that there's some sort of death that's involved in vanity, that it is a lifeless pursuit. And to give you a more kind of dramatic example, we have Picasso here. And does anybody know what this is portraying? All right, no hands go up. That's not surprising. So this one, Guernica, was painted as a representation of the bombing of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War. So this is the bombing of a city during the Spanish Civil War. Now, if you were brought up on abstract art, if you were brought up on Cubism, if you spent your years learning the language of Cubism, according to Goodman's theory, when I popped this up on the screen, everybody in here would have been like, oh, well, that's a city being bombed. And if I said, yes, it's called Guernica, you would have been like, oh, is that the name of that city? Okay. But it would have been immediate, right? The same way when I put up the School of Athens, nobody here, you might not have known that it was a School of Athens, but you would have, everybody was like, well, there's a building, there's a bunch of people, some of them are holding books, some of them are lying down. You decoded the picture because you understood the language. According to Goodman's theory, nobody knew what this was because nobody knows this language. But if you spent time learning this language, then if a new painting done in this style was shown to you, it would be immediate. You take a look at it and go, oh, I get it. I know what that is. That's a car driving through the mountains. Good picture. All right, so that's Goodman's theory. Not surprisingly, objections to Goodman's symbol theory of pictorial information. So the big objection, we've already seen this one, is perspective. So whereas Gibson's 1954 theory leaned heavy on perspective and excluded some pictures because of it. Goodman's theory, on the other hand, almost excluded perspective and failed because of certain properties of perspective that seem to be special. So Goodman's theory, symbol theory of pictorial information, basically says that pictures are like a language. And one of the things about languages is that the labels that we use in a language are pretty arbitrary, and the labels that we use in a language are just a convention. So once again, going back to the example of dog, we use the word dog because at some point in our language, people got together and said, what do you want to call that thing? And somebody said dog. And everybody said, can we agree on that? And they were all like, yeah, let's call that thing dog. And that's how dogs got labeled dogs. Elsewhere in the world, somebody was like, qu'est-ce que chose et vous? That's not right. I was in Canada, I got high school French. Qu'est-ce que c'est? And une personne dit, c'est un chien. D'accord? And everybody was like, yeah, d'accord, chien. Right? So everywhere around the world, it was basically arbitrary.
What language are you speaking?
French. Yeah, sorry. Should be apparent. I'm gonna have to hand in my Canada card. But anyways, it's arbitrary. And very few words in our language are actually non-arbitrary. So those are the, I believe they're called onomatopoeias. They're the words that actually sound like the words. So buzz is not arbitrary because buzz is talking about the sound that sounds like buzz, right? But most words are arbitrary, and it's just a convention. So according to Neil Goodman's theory of pictorial information, symbol theory of pictorial information, the same is true of pictures. The systems that we use, the languages that we use for pictures, they're just arbitrary. And it seemed like that for a while because when Cubism came along, they basically just said, let's start doing pictures this way. And when other art movements came along, they basically just said, let's start doing pictures this way with this system. So is it that this symbol theory of pictorial information is true, that all of these are just conventions, just agreements upon ways of doing things? Well, the one that doesn't seem to be a convention is perspective. So some say, and there's evidence that perspective is not a convention. So once again, we got Gibson coming back in 1960. And he says it does not seem reasonable to assert that the use of perspective in paintings is merely a convention to be used or discarded by the painter as he chooses. When the artist transcribes what he sees upon a two-dimensional surface, he uses perspective geometry of necessity. So Gibson was trying to argue that there might be things that you can add to a picture. There might be other conventions that you can adopt, but there's something special about perspective. Perspective is a better system than all the other systems, and this is something that we don't find in language. It's very hard to argue that English is a better language than French. French is a better language than German. There are some differences, but mostly you cannot say this is more language than this other language. But Gibson was arguing that perspective holds this special place. It has this special status in picture making that isn't shared by any other conventions. So other people say that perspective is a convention. So Goodman came back. You can see the kind of back and forth through history. So Goodman came back in 1968, and he said in diametric contradiction to what Gibson said. So basically saying Gibson's wrong. The artist who wants to produce a spatial representation that the present day Western eye will accept as faithful. So the artist that wants to draw something that looks good to our current eyes must defy the laws of geometry. So Goodman in this case is completely correct. And it is a mystery that is still trying to be solved about why, if you draw according to perspective perfectly, your pictures will look weird. Specifically, they will look weird on the margins of your picture and very, very close to the center of your picture if you use perspective exactly. So that's another story. Again, we seem to use an approximation to perspective. And again, this falls under the idea that our minds are as smart as they need to be and as stupid as they can be. So our minds do not need to devote massive amounts of information to do perspective geometry perfectly, because in most situations in our everyday life, we just need an approximation. But that's another aside. Anyways, so this is the key here. If perspective is a convention, then there must be other conventions. So other people pointed out that there are these other conventions. So outside of Western culture, Chinese and Japanese paintings assign linear perspective a diametrically opposite role from that given it by Western painters. In their system, parallel lines converge as they approach the spectator. They open up the space instead of closing it. So in Western paintings, when you have railroad tracks going off into the distance, those railroad tracks will converge, they'll meet. Parallel in the real world, in our pictures, they will meet. Goodman would say that's a symbol, right? Meeting together at a point in the distance, that indicates that they're parallel. An example of another convention in Chinese and Japanese paintings, they didn't have convergence, they had divergence. So if something was going off into the distance, instead of it coming to a point, it would diverge. And that is an argument that it's another convention, and it's just another language that they use for their paintings. So I was looking for an example of this in Japanese and Chinese paintings. I couldn't find one, so I just put this one here because it's just a cool painting. But anyways, let's take a look at an example of that from Western painting. So before perspective was all figured out, here's an example from the pre-Renaissance here. And in this painting, if you analyze it and you take a look at parallel lines, parallel edges, so not parallel lines, parallel edges. So this is a rectangular column here, and yet it goes off into the distance, but the lines actually diverge. And we have another rectangular column right here, and once again, it is drawn with these diverging lines. So not converging, diverging. So somebody who had developed this system said, all right, you want to make things look as if they're parallel, draw them as diverging, right? Draw this as diverging, and that'll let people know that it's going off into the distance, but that these edges are really parallel. And the symbol we'll use for that is this divergence. So the argument for the symbol theory is that this convention is just as good as perspective. And if it is just as good as perspective, then that would indicate that maybe perspective is just another language. It's just another convention. So there's nothing really special about it. There's no reason to kind of give it this special status because other systems are just as good. All right, as it turns out, other systems are not just as good. There does seem to be something very, very special about perspective. There is a key difference between regular normal geometric perspective and this inverse perspective, and that has to do with the fact that linear perspective, the perspective that Gibson was talking about, the perspective that Brunelleschi discovered the techniques for and shared with the painters in the Renaissance, linear perspective is systematic. So far, to my knowledge, no other system of painting, no other system of pictures is systematic. And what does systematic mean? Systematic means that unlike inverse perspective, if you draw something in perspective, there is nothing that is out there that you cannot represent correctly using perspective. On the other hand, with inverse perspective, there are situations in the real world that cannot be represented using inverse perspective. And this is literally the same kind of idea as saying, well, in English language, you can represent ownership. You can say that I own this cup. I just bought a new pair of jeans. You can express that concept. If we came across another language and we asked them, do you have this concept? And they're like, oh yeah, we have this concept. And we said, how do you express it in your language? And they said, we can't. We don't have the ability to say that in our language. You could then make an argument that their language is not as good because there are concepts that they cannot express. So if you ask them, what about colors? You got words for colors? And if they say no, we have no way of expressing certain colors. You would say, well, our language is better than yours is, so there's something more special or more complete about our language. It turns out that linear perspective has that completeness, whereas any other system does not. So if you look at inverse perspective, there will be situations such as this one over here, The Trinity by Andrei Rublev, where you could not represent this situation without contradictions in the picture. So in the real world, you can have a chair here, you can have a chair here, you can have a table here, you can have 3 people sitting around that table. But in the representation of it, there's all of these kinds of little errors here, little contradictions here. So you can see that this surface that is supposed to be flat on the ground somehow is raised up so that the surface of the leg and it don't match. So this footstool that's supposed to be flat cannot be drawn in inverse perspective as being flat and lining up with the leg here the way that it actually does. And that occurs on the other side as well. And then if you take a look at the edges of the table here, these edges of the table, they are diverging, right? So they would be diverging in perspective, in inverse perspective. These chairs over here are diverging in inverse perspective, and they would intersect here. They would occupy the same physical space here, which is a contradiction, which is why Rublev decided to cover that particular point up so that that wouldn't be readily apparent. Mm-hmm.
Does inverse perspective refer specifically to that parallel line example only, or does it refer to other like aspects of art as well?
It would refer to things in the distance basically diverging instead of converging.
Okay.
The clearest example is lines.
Okay.
But the same way that perspective deals with every kind of aspect of how big and where should things be, inverse perspective, I believe, does the same.
Oh.
Yeah. But importantly, it's just not, it's not, you cannot do everything without contradiction. So here's an example of trying to represent a spatial arrangement, but in inverse perspective, contradictions arise that cannot be overcome within this system. There's literally no way in this language to express that these two are not going to be intersecting each other, which is why it's covered up, which is basically a way of going, let's not talk about it. On the other hand, here's an example of Leonardo da Vinci's painting The Last Supper, and here we have 12 people, 13 actually seated. We got tons of chairs, we got tons of food, we got doors, we got paintings, and nothing in here is contradictory. Nothing overlaps. There's no thing in the real world that cannot be represented using this perspective painting or this perspective language. So it seems that unlike the one of the core ideas of Goodman's symbol theory, that these are just conventions, it seems that there is something very specific about perspective. There is something very special about it. It is its own kind of specialized system. So while you can invent other systems, they just don't seem to be able to encompass as much as perspective does. And that would argue against the idea that picture perception is just a conventional language that we all know. All right, any questions on that? All right, so what do? Let's get to the better definition that came out from Gibson back in 1971. This is the last one. So one last definition, and again, this is one of the things just to kind of bring up at this point is that in any scientific endeavor, you cannot do any good work in that scientific endeavor. You can't do any good work in that field until you know and can clearly define what it is that you're working on. So there's a reason if you look at perception, you will notice that there is a ton of research, really good research on color perception. And one of the reasons why there's so much good research on color perception is because very quickly they were able to determine a definition of color, and they were able to determine concepts to express color. They came up with a color space. So color space, you have hue, which is the color. You got saturation, which is how much of the color is in there. Is it close to gray, or is it, you know, a very vibrant color? And then you got brightness. How bright is the color? And they found that you can classify all these colors that we perceive in that particular space. And then that just opened up color perception, and that's why we have so many articles on color perception. Look up olfactory perception and see how many articles they have compared to color perception. It is almost non-existent. And the reason is because there is no smell space, right? There is no dimension that people say, okay, this smell has this much hue, it's got this much brightness. It doesn't even make sense, right? And that's why there's almost no research done on olfactory perception. To my knowledge, the only dimension that they have currently that people agree on is pleasant versus unpleasant. That's the only one. But anything else is still up for debate. So nailing down a definition is the most important thing that you can do in order to start understanding something. And if you don't have that definition, then you don't even know where to look. Because if Goodman was right, then we should all look at pictures using that language approach. But if he's wrong, then that's a complete waste of time. We're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to answer that behavior. So yeah, there's a lot of definitions. I wish I could say we've nailed it and we've got it down correct. But as things continue to develop, we'll eventually get there. But much like anything in psychology, the definition is key. And if you look at abnormal psychology and how long it's taken for them to make strides with certain mental disorders were understood very quickly. Other mental disorders, not so much. And one of the reasons that could possibly be is because they don't have good definitions of those other mental disorders. So if you label something as schizophrenia, but it is one of 50 different things, then you are going to get mixed results and you're going to get almost nowhere until you come up with that excellent definition of schizophrenia. So keep that in mind anytime you enter a field. Ask the people, what is your definition of this? Because sometimes it's readily apparent. If somebody came up to me and said, what's your definition of pictures? I would be like, well, I kind of have this work. I'm kind of working with this definition right now. But again, it's important to have that definition because that's the only way that you can progress in science. Yep.
Is there someone that we're using like right now?
What was that?
Is this the definition we're using right now? Kind of?
This is the definition. If I had to kind of, people are using either Goodman's or Gibson's. So a lot of people still have that idea of vision as pictures as a visual language, and they'll be using that definition, and they'll still kind of argue against perspective being important. And this one here argues against perspective being required, but it's still the important one. Actually, I'll say that in a different way. It argues against we use perspective structure, we use invariant structure, but that's made by perspective. But yeah, I would say on one side of the argument, you have people using Goodman's definition, and then on the other end, we got people using this definition. All right, so what's this maybe better definition? All right, so we got Gibson again, changing his mind, and this time saying a picture is a surface so treated that a delimited optic array. So we're still talking about this treated surface that a optic array to a point of observation is made available that contains the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic array of the ordinary environment. So he has basically taken his original definition and relaxed it. And instead of saying that it's the exact pattern of light coming from the picture that you would have received in the real environment, what he's now saying is that you have the same information coming from the picture that you would have had from the original environment. Another way of saying that is that the invariant information that is coming from the environment is now reproduced in the picture. So perspective information might not be there, but those invariant relations, that invariant structure is still present in that picture. So the core of this is the picture as information definition, and it tells you that it gives you basically this optical information, this information that your visual system picks up that specifies these properties of the world. And these are, again, this idea of we pick up information from the environment. There's invariant information in the environment, relations in this geometry of light that does not change as you move through your environment. And that optical information is what the picture reproduces. Not the exact light that's coming there, but the same optical information. So to give you an example of optical information, the idea of optical information, so this is Mitch Hedberg here, one of my favorite comedians, unfortunately passed away, too young, but he was very good at kind of like mixing literal and metaphorical verbal things. So I love this one. He goes, I once saw a forklift lift a crate of forks, and it was way too literal for me. But the other one that's important for us is this one right here. So he goes, Swiss cheese is my favorite kind because it's the only cheese you can draw with a pencil and paper. And then he went on and he goes, hey, do you got Swiss cheese in your sandwich? Sometimes, because it's got holes in it. So it's not going to be there every bite. But anyway, so Swiss cheese is my favorite kind. But notice, because it's the only cheese you can draw with a pencil and paper. So let's take a look at that. This here is something, right? This is a picture of something. But what is this a picture of, right? So the information here is not enough for us to identify this. So this could be a slice of cake, right? It's consistent with a slice of cake. This could be a Trivial Pursuit piece, right? If you play Trivial Pursuit, it could be one of those little segments. This could be a brick that you're using, in your driveway. This could be a wedge of cheese, right? This could be many, many different things. You cannot draw those things with a pencil and paper. You can draw Swiss cheese with a pencil and paper. There is one thing that this is, and that is Swiss cheese. And the reason is that whatever information in the real world determines Swiss cheese is being reproduced in this picture here. So it's not yellow. There's very little texture. There's very little brightness or anything. But this shape, along with these holes, provides us that information that this is Swiss cheese. So the fact that we can recognize this, and if I asked you, what is this? Just about everybody here would say, that looks like Swiss cheese. Means that this picture here, while it's not reproducing the light that you would see when you look at Swiss cheese, is reproducing the information that would come from Swiss cheese. And importantly, it's reproducing the information that we use to identify Swiss cheese. So that's the idea of pictures as information. They don't have to look like a photorealistic picture anymore, but what they do is they provide you with that information that is specific, that specifies this object in the real world. All right, so again, this specifies the information of a model airplane. This specifies the information of a bridge. And the reason that a caricature looks like a photorealistic image of the individual is because this specifies the same information that is present here. So while this has lost a lot of its perspective structure, the invariant relations that are here are the same as the invariant relations that are here. Those unchanging relationships in this space that specify this as Barack Obama are here in the photorealistic picture, and they're also here in the caricature. And that's what a skilled caricature artist will do. They will develop techniques and skills that allows them to destroy this perspective structure while still maintaining those invariant relations that specify the same things. All right, so that's the pictures as information. There are still objections to this. We're not done with picture perception as a behavior. And one of the big objections to the pictures as information is the idea of metaphoric pictures. And that's one of the reasons why that is my current area of research. Because again, if this doesn't cover this, then it can't be a real definition. So the best way to find out what's wrong is to actually study what's missing. So metaphoric pictures, these I always use the word literally when I'm talking about metaphoric pictures. These are pictures that do not, by definition, do not contain the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic array of an ordinary environment. So the definition of a metaphoric picture is a picture of something that does not happen in the real world. So it's much like a linguistic metaphor. So if if somebody has a bad Valentine's Day and they're all grumpy and they walk up to you and they're like, "Oh man, Valentine's sucks," and you're like, "Well, what happened?" And they're like, "Man, my boyfriend John has a heart of stone." You would not at that point go, "Oh my gosh, let's get him to the hospital. He's got a heart of stone. He's got seconds to live. Where is he? Call an ambulance." No, you don't do that because you understand. It's not real. It's not a real heart of stone. It's metaphoric. He's emotionless. He's cold. He's not giving. Same thing with metaphoric pictures. They don't describe what's in the actual environment, right? Just like linguistics. It's not an actual heart of stone. Metaphoric pictures do the same thing. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So this is an example of metaphoric pictures. Surprisingly, this is not an example of metaphoric pictures. So that's metaphoric, that's not metaphoric. The difference here is that even though unicorns do not exist, if they did, this would occur in the real world, right? So if they existed, they would have horns attached to their heads in the real world. So this would be a literal picture of these mythical creatures. So it's not that it does or doesn't exist in the real world that's the key. It's whether or not it happens in the real world that's the key. Yep.
But like, if enormous ghost lions existed in the real world,
ghost lions,
they would
yes,
look like that.
Exactly.
So I don't understand why that's not metaphoric either. It's only metaphoric.
Because when people saw this image initially, how many people thought gigantic ghost lions? How many people thought regular lions, but they're the kings of the wild? They are powerful in their environment. How many thought something along those lines? Exactly. So that's what makes this metaphoric. This is literally like John has a heart of stone, and you're like, "Oh, okay, I get it. He's cold, he's heartless." And that's, I'm glad you pointed that out, because nobody ever sees this picture and says, "Oh my gosh, ghost lions, when did this happen? When is this? Did anybody alert, gigantic ghost lions, to boot?" No, but you look at this and you're not surprised, right? You don't look at this and get scared. You look at this and you go, "Huh, you know what? Yeah, lions are powerful. Yeah, they are kings of their domain. Yeah, I get it. I get the metaphor that you're trying to say." So that's a metaphorical picture, but notice that this idea of power, this idea of dominance, this idea of ruling over an area never happens in the real world. And yet we understand it, right? We get it. So the fact that we can get this means that Gibson's final definition of information reproducing what's out there in the real world cannot be true, because this information is never out there in the real world. So this is why I kind of do the work that I'm doing right now. So what we're going to do to wrap up today, we still got about like 20 minutes left. We're going to start taking a look at some ideas for metaphoric pictures so that we can check the analysis of that work that I was doing in understanding why is it that when we take a look at this, we don't say, "Oh my gosh, ghost lions." And how is it that we take this information and understand and combine it with the literal information that is actually there? Yep.
So do metaphoric pictures fall more in line with Goodman's theory then, as like symbols?
They could.
Okay.
They could. So metaphoric pictures could fall more in line with Goodman's. It would definitely be kind of connected to say that, okay, gigantic size means importance. gigantic size means power, and then that would be just a convention that we choose. One of the objections of that is that this is an arbitrary. So there is no culture in the world where we've seen pictures that are metaphoric and they have said, you know what, let's draw our king super small. Because in our culture, super small is going to mean really powerful. That doesn't happen. So whereas it's a little bit easier to explain how we understand metaphors, why this is big equals power is the link that you can't extract. That's not conventional. There was a
So are comic books full of metaphoric pictures?
yes.
Like that's all they're composed of?
No, but that is it's not all that they're composed of. But to my knowledge, it is the one genre that uses it very, very regularly. And one of the things that you need if you're going to do research in these areas, oftentimes you need a lot of examples. So when I was doing research on spatial perception, and I needed pictures and paintings that were easily mapped out in terms of their spatial relations, the easiest way to do that is to find a painting of tiles. Because once you got tiles, you know that something is 1, 2, 3, 4 tiles over, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiles deep. And you can literally map out the entire area. It just so happens that the Renaissance loved their tiles. And if I found a picture of tiles, 9 times out of 10, it was a Renaissance picture. So that just meant that that was a genre that I could go to and find the stimuli that I needed. Same thing with comic book images. For some reason, because of that genre, one of the things that they had to portray was motion. So comic books were often action-oriented. They were trying to tell an action story. And because of that, they had to depict motion. And they regularly used metaphors to help convey that information. So when I was looking through regular paintings for motion, there's almost no motion in paintings. Because most of the time, they would say, all right, you stand like this for 14 hours and I'll paint you. You know, they're not like, keep running back and forth and let me get this motion. So it's very little motion, very little use of metaphors. So that's why a lot of the work that I did just went to comic books and said, let's take a look at these hundreds of thousands, if not millions of examples, so that we can get a nice sample. Mm-hmm.
Well, wouldn't that too be like the easiest, I guess, use the shortest amount of like paper? Because it makes me think of like, you know, when they were like first doing movies, and if they wanted to show motion, you had to like hold the book and then like flip it, like all the pages, like the 10 million pages, to see like just someone run from like the tree to the house. But if you use a metaphor, you can just do it on like one little cube, I guess, or tile with so much less time and work.
So that might be another reason why it's very prevalent in comic books, just because of the lack of infinite space to kind of tell these stories. There was also the other things that I love about this is that if you ever want to take a look at artifacts and map them onto cognitive processes, one of the things that you have to ensure is that your artifact works. So I could take a look at that Picasso painting, Guernica, and I could analyze it for the information that it gives. I could analyze it for how different features are combined. But I'm not analyzing anything about how your minds work, because none of you looked at that picture and said, I get it. Everybody was confused, which means whatever information was in that picture was confusing, and you weren't processing it because that's not the way that your mind works. On the other hand, when you take a look at something that is in popular culture, when you take a look at something that lives and dies by how many units it can sell, when you look at something that's popular, it's literally society's stamp of approval saying, we understand this. That's why we bought it. And there are examples in my work where we took a look at different strategies for portraying motion, and we mapped them over time. And some of the strategies, they would start off being used, and over time they would increase. And other strategies, they would start off being used, and over time they were abandoned. And those strategies that were abandoned, because it was a popular medium, were literally the strategies where people either did not buy the comic because they're like, I don't understand what this artist is trying to portray, or they sent letters. There's a letters page on comic books where they basically said, the way you draw Quicksilver sucks, and your art is horrible, why don't you hire somebody else? To which that artist would basically have said, oh, they're not getting it. They don't understand when I use this strategy that he's supposed to be running super fast. Let me try something else. So you can literally see the development of strategies drop off and become part of the way that they communicate. Yep. And plus it's one of the really big things though is that you can literally get samples of like hundreds of thousands of these images, and it really is just something that you need as a psychologist. Because one last thing is that for any, let me just bring up the one that we're going for today. For anything that you want to prove as a psychologist or as a scientist, there is usually one example out there that will fit your theory, right? So if you want to show that, I don't want to get too political here, but I feel it coming. Okay, so if you want to show that women are violent, right? You can find that one female serial killer. You can go to Canada. We had Catherine Homolka, one of the worst female serial killers in the history of modern times. So you can always find that one example, right? And if I was somebody who was trying to argue that women are going to destroy us, I could say, hey, take a look at Catherine Homolka. And the way to get around that is to say, well, let's take a sample. Let's take a sample of 1,000 serial killers. Let's take a sample of 2,000. And then let's take a look at how many are female, how many are male, what do the females do, what do the males do? And then you finally get to the truth of the matter. So when you're taking a look at artifacts that humans have created, one of the big important things is to take a sample of those artifacts. Because you can always find one that fits your theory if you look hard enough. And if you find something that's popular, again, it's that stamp of approval that it actually works. And that's why a lot of times I make the argument that if I wanted to support the idea that comic books use multiple metaphors, then all I would need to do is just go and self-publish my own comic book and put people running in that comic book. There we go. Using multiple metaphors, right? Using multiple images, multiple metaphors, right? Using propositions, running, right? Nobody's going to buy this. This is ineffective, but it exists. So anytime you read work that's been done by analyzing these artifacts that humans have created, if they want to extrapolate from that how our mental processes work, number one, it's got to be a sample. It's got to be a sample of images, artifacts, whatever it is that you're analyzing. Number two, if it's popular, it's that stamp of approval that everybody in the world said, I get this, I understand this. All right, so let's introduce this special topic, perception of the LA-MOAD theory. This is all going to be about metaphors. So a bit of this will be a review. We'll get probably to the pictorial devices here. So metaphors, linguistic and visual, and then pictorial devices, literal and metaphorical. And that'll be the time that we have today. So let's take a look at, once again, the idea of metaphor. So linguistically, the grass is green. We understand that as a literal statement. We understand that somebody is trying to say the grass is actually the color green. On the other hand, he has a heart of stone. We understand that that's metaphorical. That is not what the person is trying to communicate. It's not trying to communicate an actual literal heart of stone. It's a metaphorical idea of coldness, emotionless personality types. Life is a journey. If somebody ever tells you, you know what, you got to realize that life is a journey, you don't say to yourself, well, okay, I'll pack my suitcase. I guess I'll start hitchhiking because that's what life is, right? I got to go on a journey. No, you understand that it's a beginning, it has an end, it's not about the destination, it's about, you know, the time, you know, you understand the underlying information, that it's not literal, it's metaphorical. The same way in pictures, you can have literal pictures. So this is an example of a literal picture of somebody running. And it's literal because it actually reproduces the features that happen in the real world when a person runs. So when a person runs in the real world, their arms and legs will be in this position. And when a person runs in the real world, they will be off the ground. That is one of the literal definitions of running in the Olympics, that at some point, both your feet will be off the ground. And we can perceive literal pictures. So here we have a literal picture of people standing. And once again, a literal picture of somebody running. We can perceive this, and we can perceive motion. So once again, this is clearly somebody that's in motion, but this is a static image, right? So how does this image convey to us that this person is in motion? Well, one way is to use the actual literal features that a person has when they're running. Often, other times, though, you'll use metaphorical information. So here's an example of a girl that is falling, and when you fall, you do not literally split into three individuals, right? This is a metaphor showing the progression of her as she fell. And once again, we have this person here who is jumping, and again, you do not split into four individuals when you jump, and we understand this as a metaphor. Now, some of the work that I'm doing currently has to do with how do we decide that this is a metaphor? So how do we know that this is not the famous jumping quadruplets, right? This is part of their act where they jump very closely one after another. We've been looking at this to see what information is there to indicate that this is actually a metaphor when it could maybe be quadruplets, maybe be motion. But importantly, if this is understood as metaphorical, we know that this does not happen. You don't split up into four individuals when you jump. All right, so the first step we needed, once again, definition. What are we going to consider metaphorical? What are we going to consider literal? Went to Kennedy's work in 1982. And literal devices, these represent what is actually present in the 3D scene. Metaphorical devices, they represent what is not present in the 3D scene. So literal devices represent what actually is out there. Metaphorical devices, they're in the picture, but they don't actually occur out there in the real world. Another way to think of this is literal devices follow the rules. They follow the rules of things like perspective. Metaphorical devices, they actually break the rules. So they actually break with convention. And you can see that this is very close to linguistic as well. So when somebody says the grass is green, they are following the rules of language to describe the literal truth of what the grass is like. When somebody says he has a heart of stone, they are breaking the rules of language. And you have to pick up on that violation and say, he has a heart of stone, he should be dead, this person's calm, therefore, not a heart of stone, actually meaning something else. So metaphorical pictures, things that are not in the 3D scene, literal devices represent what is in the 3D scene. So that's what makes this a literal picture, because when you run, you are literally like this. When you run, you are literally off the ground. That's what makes this a metaphorical picture, because splitting into three different people does not happen in the real world. Mm-hmm.
When you say, like, if someone says a heart of stone, and you're going to say, like, they're, like, you know, that's a metaphor. What about a little kid? Because they're really going to think that that person has a heart of stone. So when did that develop?
That's a very interesting question. Linguistically, I'm not so sure. But I do know that if you show children, I believe the study was like 8-year-olds, like grade 3-ish, below grade 3, if you show them metaphorical pictures like this, they will interpret it as literal. They will be like, oh, those three children, you know, they're going to bump into each other. After about grade 3, then they start understanding metaphors. And again, it's part of that ability to process that information and process it correctly. Mm-hmm.
There's probably also, like, I think that some people are not good at understanding metaphors either, right? Like, isn't there like a level of...
There is individual differences in your ability to understand metaphor. Yeah. And what you basically need to do is you need to detect the violation. So there are some, and there's an entire, you look up metaphoric research and check out the thousands of articles in psychology, not to mention the thousands of articles in other disciplines. But there are things about how metaphors develop. So we have things like things that are known as dead metaphors. And these are metaphors that have previously been metaphorical, but now we understand them as literal. So one example of that is the deadline. There used to be an actual deadline, which was a line that was drawn. And if you were, I believe it was for prisoners, if you walked across that line, you would be shot. That was your deadline. And if you stayed on the other side of that line, you were fine. And then people started applying it metaphorically. And they started saying, oh, you got that big assignment. When's the deadline? After that, you're going to be in trouble. Before that, you're fine. And now we just say, you know what, Tuesday's the deadline. And we're like, okay, that's when it's due. I guess that's what it literally means. So some metaphors become dead metaphors like that. They're known as dead metaphors. And then other things about how do metaphors kind of spread in our language. So somebody at some point had to have said, man, you know, life is a journey. And somebody else said, whoa, that's good. Can I use that? And then it kind of spread, right? And other metaphors just don't happen, right? So like, you know, the only thing that pops up in my mind is Mean Girls. Remember when they were trying to get fetch to happen? And they were like, fetch is never going to happen. Fetch is a metaphor, right? Fetch is actually going to retrieve something that you want close to you. So that's so fetch is something that you're actually going to want to have. Not going to happen, right? So how does that spread? There's tons of work on development of metaphors. Yep.
I'm going to test it on my kids today.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're kindergarten through 6th grade.
Okay.
So I'm going to check.
Yeah.
To see when.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll let you know.
Yeah, let me know. Let me know how it goes. If that's the kind of if it works on your kids, if they're at the right age. But that's actually like one of the very difficult things about metaphoric picture perception is, again, that idea of what exactly is a metaphor. So, for example, this multiple image. As this becomes so widely used that we no longer even consider it to be metaphorical, it's just become kind of like a literal device. It's like a dead metaphor. What do we consider to be literal or metaphorical? And as we're going to see, one of the best arguments that this is actually metaphorical is that when we go through the LA-MOAD theory, you'll see that this information combines with literal information in a different way than this information combines with metaphorical information. So when you try to combine metaphorical information together, it combines in a different way than when you combine literal information together or when you combine metaphorical and literal information together. So that difference in our minds means that this is being processed somehow differently than this is. And there's actually different to our minds, these two types of images. So whether or not we can nail that with a definition, I don't know. Maybe it'll be me in 2027 up here on the board, you know, with the absolute picture definitions. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. We're going to talk about a lot of fuzzy edges here, and it's good to think about those because that's where you really get those ideas where the science actually succeeds or breaks down. All right, so we are not at the fuzzy edge. We are at the end of class today. So that's it for today. So we're going to pick it up here. If you haven't read the article yet, give it a try. But again, I'm going to, in this presentation, I'm going to assume that you did not read the article. But again, the more you can kind of grapple with it, the better off you'll be in terms of understanding the material. Other than that, have a wonderful weekend.